motion that came up in a society that I know of, and try to teach you guys, not teach you, give you tips on perhaps how I would approach the motion and how I would approach the case. And perhaps I think the title of the lecture is kind of misleading in that, yeah, sure, arguments and rebuttals are important, but I think to a certain degree, the distinction between arguments and rebuttals are, number one, very, very vague. It's very, like, you can't decipher what is meant in a critical note and what is meant in a constructive note. That's why you always have the debate on whether whip speakers are supposed to credit arguments but not rebuttals, right? It's hard for a judge to decipher what is an argument and what is a rebuttal that you can credit from a whip speech, majorly because, yeah, whip speakers are not allowed to bring arguments, but they're allowed to bring rebuttals, but, like, you can't really get the difference. So I'm just going to teach you guys generally how to approach motions, I think, try to get you guys to get a general idea. And Shihi, I think, is going to specify on details of how to build specific arguments. And yeah, it's mostly due to the fact that I'm a whimsical case builder. That's why from motion to motion, I do good on some motions, I do bad on some motions. Okay, so the motion we're going to practice with is, just a sec, I'll give you exact wording. This came out in a session once. Okay, so this is my relative forte, but mind you that I'm not an economics major. A lot of you guys are, so probably you guys know, like, theoretically a lot more about this issue than I do. Okay, the motion is this house supports robot taxes. I'm pretty sure this turned up as one of the practice motions for a session in a society. So this house supports robot taxes. They didn't provide much on the info slide for this motion, so I'm just going to go with it. Robot taxes basically mean, like in the info slide it said, to levy tax on the use of robots for industrial automation. It basically didn't tell you anything. So I'm just going to flow this class thingy based on this motion. And if we have extra time, we're going to practice with another motion, okay? So the first thing I do when I approach a motion or when I look at a motion is like usually your senpais, when they give you lectures on how to approach a motion, they ask you to like read the motion and break down the motion word by word and think about the motion word by word. But I think this is a realistically hard thing to keep, especially if you're in a 15-minute time constraint, you're like rushed, you feel like you need 3 arguments, 2 for yourself, 1 for your partner. Like, realistically, it's hard. And I think this is why most rookies, when they come up to the podium to speak, they like literally define every word that doesn't need to be defined. Like, for instance, like if the motion is, this house believes that euthanasia can be justified, probably the contentious part is euthanasia, not whether the meaning of justified is contentious or not. Probably the idea of the idea of justified is probably similar from person to person. Probably the word itself is not contentious and therefore you don't have to define it. So for this motion, it's not really much of a problem since the motion consists of 5 words. Like, it's not complicated. I think, however, for this motion, when you say robot taxes, and when the motion slide, the info slide explicitly states that it's for industrial automation, I think the prime variable for this debate would be what industries we're talking about, right? So like this, I think the first step, if I try to state this as explicitly as possible, is don't focus on all the words within the motions. Try to stick with words that will change the direction of the debate, okay? Don't stick with the tiny details, okay? So try to think and identify words that act as variables. Second is, now this part is kinda, I think this part is kinda different from debater to debater based on style, but the second thing you would usually hear from your senpais is to think of the problem, right? Again, I think this is unrealistic. There are motions where you simply cannot know what the problem is. Like, for instance, there was one motion that I tried to make in the last year YU monthly. The motion was, this house supports S2155 of the Trump administration. Obviously, if I word it like that, no one's gonna know what the hell I'm talking about, right? It's like a resolution to repeal the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act that the Obama administration made. But that aside, right? So there are motions that you would really not know the problem for, and there are motions where you would like very vaguely know the problem. Okay? So I think for this motion, although I think it's possible to get a vague problem, or to a certain degree, get a very vague idea of what the problem is, it would be very hard to identify a full-fledged problem from the start. What I'm trying to tell you guys is that you guys don't need to have a specific outlined version of the problem from the very start. I think the problem analysis comes as you develop the case. So just try to come up with a really general problem, something that is really, really damn obvious, and then try to evolve your problem analysis as you develop on the contextualization. So the second step is, don't try to have a specific problem, like multifaceted problems, just have a very general problem. General, probably obvious problem. Because you need at least the obvious problem in order to start the contextualization, okay? So in this motion, what do you think is the most intuitive problem? All we need is one. Like, throw any ideas.
Replacing people.
Yeah, replacing people, probably, right? That's all we need for the contextualization. Replacing people. Main problem. Right. So the third step obviously would be then contextualization, okay? So yes, this part I would agree with a lot of your senpais. You are supposed to think of the contexts and the situations where this problem would be the most relevant. So you would need to consider the context under which this problem is the most relevant. So let's go back to the motion, okay? So since we're practicing with this motion. The motion said that robots and robot taxes are taxes levied on, guys, you don't have to be pressured to write this down. Okay, so the motion was stating that robot taxes are taxes levied on the automation of industries, right? So let's first talk about what industries this would be most relevant for, okay? So what industries do you think would this motion probably be the most relevant? Okay?
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing, yeah, sure. Any other ideas? Sorry? Oh, sorry. Transportation. Okay. Transportation. Let's have that on the list. There are like so many industries, the point being, okay? I think, however, if you're opening government and you have to build a case for like that incorporates all the industries on the planet, you're probably not going to be able to win the debate. Why? The reason being, there are just so many industries around the world. If you try to defend robot taxes for all of the industries, you're biting too much of a burden, right? So I think the important part of the third step is to try to strategically narrow down or widen the scope of the context that you guys are trying to cover. And I think this is important because it covers and is directly correlated to how much burdens you take on, okay? So the important part of the third step is to narrow down, or in many cases, there are cases where you don't have to narrow down the context. In fact, there are cases where you think the motion is thin, very thin initially, motions where you think that materials are not really enough for a 7-minute speech, but as you develop your case, you feel that the motion can be expanded to a lot of contexts, okay? So the strategy for the third step is you narrow down or you expand the context strategically to your interest. So for this debate, since you're forcing a policy, and by the way, usually for policy debates, not narrative debates, usually for policy debates, it's strategic for government to narrow down the debate to a certain extent. It's strategic for the government to narrow down the debate to a certain extent to try to lessen the burdens that they take on. I think this is different from house setting. Like for instance, let's say that there was a motion. This house believes that males should take leadership in feminist movements in conservative nations, right? However, there are multiple nations that can be categorized as conservative nations. In this case, I think, sure, it's nice to be like incorporative of a lot of conservative contexts, but it might be realistically hard for you to talk about every kind of conservative nation. Like for instance, Saudi Arabia, for instance, there are conservative communities within the United States, like Mormon communities, for instance, religious communities, and perhaps South Korea and nations ridden with Confucian morality and ethics and stuff like that. There are different versions, and I think it's your job to find the most relevant context. And so sure, if you just throw the judges and the debaters that this is going to be the main issue of the debate, probably they will just buy it as house setting and think that you're narrowing down the debate too much. So you often need a justification as to why this context is the most relevant. So, like after strategically expanding and narrowing down the context, what you need to do is you need to provide a justification. You need to provide a justification, a logical justification for why you want to narrow down this debate or expand this debate, okay? So let's try it with this motion, okay? Probably there are a lot of industries, okay? Let's list every of them. The four main categories of industries are, like according to the basic social society, like social education that we get in, like social studies education we get in schools is, first the primary industry, 1차 산업 in Korean, secondary industry, tertiary, and there's the one that we all see on the news but not the textbook, the fourth industrial revolution, you know, stuff about IT and stuff like that. So fourth industrial revolution and stuff like that. So let's try to narrow down this debate, okay? Let's talk about the first one, the primary industry, like agriculture and stuff like that. Do you guys think this would be relevant in the debate? Why do you think so?
Easy to replace. It's replaceable easily.
But doesn't that mean it's relevant?
Like a lot of people are in that industry.
A lot of people are, but doesn't that make this industry more relevant to this motion, I mean? Like if a lot of people are engaging? I think what you would say is that to a certain degree, this motion implies that there are robots actively replacing people, right? To a certain degree, therefore, you would have to assume that this nation we're talking about have the capacity to buy and utilize robots. So probably we're talking about developed nations, or I'm going to add a context later on, developing nations with a booming manufacturing industry. But let's talk about the first category since we're talking about just the agriculture industry, right? If we're talking about nations, developed nations using agriculture or developing their agriculture industry, would they be using manual labor, a lot of manual labor for farming? No, right? You see, like farmers like using helicopters to seed their fields in the United States of America. They already have an automated market. They already have an automated agriculture industry that doesn't involve that much manual labor. Therefore, even if this policy passes, not a lot of farmers will go out of business, likely. They're just going to continue using helicopters to do their stuff. So probably we can cross this one out. Okay? The second one, the secondary industry. I think this can be divided into a lot of other industries. Like, let's think of examples. Like, what are some of the secondary industries you guys can think of? Like, I don't know, oil and minerals, heavy metals, like automobiles and shipbuilding, probably stuff like this, right? Automobiles and shipbuilding, and construction, stuff like that, right? But again, let's crisscross some of the industries here, because I think some of the industries here might not be as relevant as well. Okay, what would you cross off? What?
The oil and minerals?
Yeah, why would you cross that off?
Because it's already automated?
Yeah, it's already automated, yeah. It's not like if as soon as this policy passes, like they're going to change people that were hand scooping oil with machines or stuff like that. Machines are already doing that. Heavy metals, would you exclude this as well? I think it depends on what heavy metals, to be fair, but usually it's in line with the oil and mineral industry. Like usually it has to do with refining metals, and usually that's done by machines. Okay, so cross that one out. Automobiles and shipbuilding. Would you include that in the debate?
That one is relevant.
I think they're quite relevant, right? I mean, to a certain degree, the industry is automated, but to a large degree, there are workers that manually put the parts together. That's why there is a really, really strong labor union in Hyundai building cars in South Korea and like the Pohang and Gyeonggi regions and stuff like that. So I think this industry would be relevant, okay? What about construction? I'd say that's pretty relevant for the similar reasons as well. So I think even amongst the secondary industry, these industries would be included. What about the tertiary industry though? What are some of the tertiary industries? Like, for instance, finance, for instance, education, for instance, services like restaurants and stuff like that? For instance, like that. What industry would you exclude from that? Probably, I don't think the finance industry would be as relevant. Don't you think? Like, sure, I think to a large degree, number one, the finance industry already is dependent on computers and, yeah, automated mechanisms. But number two, the actual people that make the decision of where you're going to invest your money, where you're going to raise the funds and whatsoever, are probably already people and probably not that replaceable, unless you get AIs to do it, which is probably very far away in the future. So I think to a large degree, the finance industry would be out. The real estate industry as well. Things that require human decision. What about services though?
Services are done by people.
Services are probably done by people. Sure, I think you can have kiosks for automatic like menu checkings at Lotteria or something like that. But probably restaurant servers will pretty much stay the same, I think, and cooks and stuff like that. So I think that's like less relevant as well. What about the fourth industrial rev thing? What about IT technology, stuff like that? It's probably not as relevant as well if you think about it, right? Because like probably number one, if you're talking about venture capital and venture industries that are building up new technology, they're using human brains to do so, and it's not as if they're going to use machines to do it. And that's why there's actually a theory relevant to this. Have you guys ever heard of the Otter curve? So it's like this. So the Otter curve is as follows, okay? Oh, wait a sec. I switched these two. Right. This is machine reliance. Anyways, the point being, okay? The point being, the curve kind of looks like this. The reason being, this, and by the way, this is the level of advancement the industry is actually in. So for instance, this is where the first industry would be, the tertiary industry. The second would be, yes, this is where the secondary industry would be, and this is where the tertiary industry and the fourth industrial rev thing would be. And this, on the other hand, would be the ability for humans to be irreplaceable by machines. So the capacity for humans to maintain their jobs without being replaced by machines. Obviously, if you see in this curve, the secondary industry has the lowest capacity because it's the most simplest jobs that can be done and replaced by machines, okay? So I think we need to specify this motion into probably heavy metals, secondary industry related stuff, where humans have been taking part of most of the manual labor and stuff like that. Up to this part, I think it's pretty obvious, right? I know this took a lot of time because like I went through this process like process by process, but I think in a debate, I think you guys would be able to realistically like make this like brain shift within 2 to 3 minutes. I think realistically you guys can do that. So let's specify the context a bit because I think in what I've heard about the debate that happened in that specific session, most debaters just generalize that humans are going to be replaced by machines. Therefore, government has responsibility to protect them. That's too general. Number one, if you like that logic is very vacuous in that if you apply the logic that the government has responsibility to protect every citizen, you can justify any liberal policy on the planet with that justification. Probably the argument itself lacks proportionality. And exclusivity, and that you're not sure why the government's duty of protection expands specifically to this policy. So I think contextualization is very important in that it adds exclusivity. Why, especially in this case, the government's duty of protection expands to this specific policy. That's what the contextualization does. So it's very vacuous to just throw a principle like most of you do and just let that argument and try to persuade the judge with that argument. This actually goes for affirmative action debates as well. Most debaters, I think, in the early stages of debate, when they're debating a debate about quotas or affirmative action, they just throw the idea, no, the government has a duty to protect these people because these people are oppressed. Like, why in this specific policy, though? I think most debaters are vacuous in exclusively explaining why this policy is extraneously important and why under this context, no other policy will likely work as much. Okay? So I think that's what I'm trying to do with this motion. Did everyone get up to this part? Can I erase it? Right, so we're talking about those industries. Right, so let's try to build up arguments now. If we're really talking about industries like the automobiles industry and the construction industry, shipbuilding industries and stuff like that, what arguments and what unique characterizations would you be able to draw from that? Any ideas? Okay, maybe I asked too general question. So let me try to break it down a bit. First, let's try to imagine or try to think of most societies where this is the primal industry. For instance, the Rust Belt in the United States of America, or perhaps 1970s South Korea, right? Usually, these industries received heavy amounts of government subsidization and government intervention in the process of constructing the company, process of constructing the construction, the corporation itself. Why is this different from other industries, though? Like the service industry. How is this different from the service industry, though? Probably, in the case of the service industry or the agriculture industry, the government didn't heavily fund the initial creation stages of the industry itself, right? The reason being, number one, you don't need that much capital in order to initiate a business in those fields. You don't need billions of dollars to open up a hamburger joint. You don't need billions of dollars to start farming business, right? So I think the exclusive characterization that we can draw from this specific industry is that it involved heavy government intervention from the start. In the initial stages. In terms of subsidization, number one, the governments heavily subsidize this. Why would that be the case?
Because it's driving the economy.
Yeah, it's a driving force of the economy. But number two, usually these industries are critically related with vital functions of the nation. Like for instance, if we really want to talk about heavy metals, for instance, automobiles contribute to the general transportation of the nation and transporting the goods of the nation and stuff like that. For instance, if it's about the arms industry, for instance, it directly correlates with national security and the protection of the nation. So not only does the state have an incentive to subsidize and did actually subsidize these industries for economic development, they did it for the purpose of a proper functioning of the state, okay? So those two reasons, I think, are pretty enough, at least for this level. Involves heavy government intervention. What about number two? Try to imagine, like, the examples I talked about. The Rust Belt, for instance, in the case of South Korea, Ulsan and Busan, those areas. 남동 임해공업적, as like you would learn in society's education. Aren't most people in that region hired by a single major large company? That they usually are in most cases. For instance, in the case of people in the Rust Belt region, a lot of the people there were hired and specifically employed by a few really major automobile company or few really well-built heavy metals companies, right? So like this, usually the entire region has specific and very exclusive connections with the company. And this is also due to the fact that since the government subsidized the initial development stages of these companies, they naturally incentivized people to move to those regions in many cases, right? Why? Because they needed to supply these corporations that they were propping up with the workforces that are necessary, right? That's why in most cases the government offered heavy incentives for these people and other people to move into these regions to be employed by these companies. So naturally, the connection between the region and the company is totally different. Like, let's think of other industries, for instance. I don't think Burger Street in Seogang University has that much of a connection to Sinchon community as a whole. I doubt that. Like I can give you multiple examples. Like Hanyangdae, for instance. Like I don't think 고기만이 밥만이 has like the internal connection with the Hanyangdae community and whatnot, right? So I think that's the second characterization. Any like other characterizations you can think of? Guys, rack up your brains. Yep. Hello. Okay. So number 3. And this, I think, is in similar lines with the first category, the first reasoning, that there was heavy government intervention. But usually these industries were built based on not untransparent methods. What I mean by that is, usually when these industries were being built, it involved the government's choice of what actors should win in the market and what actors should lose in the market. So oftentimes these companies were usually chosen by the government as winners at the cost of letting certain industries fail, right? So I think the third characterization is that these industries were built at the sacrifice and at the cost of the government providing resources for other industries that could have been built. For instance, if it's usually the case that the nation is in the beginning stages of industrialization and most people are in the agriculture industry, but the government wants to transition to the secondary industry as the major workforce and the major industry of the country, usually it would make popular domestic sense for the government to just invest more in agriculture because most people are working in the field of agriculture. Yet they choose to devote their capital to metals industries and stuff like that because they want to think of the long term, because they want to think of the industrialization of the entire nation. So usually it comes at the sacrifice other industries. There are a lot of other characterizations you can muster, but I think these 3 are the reasonable characterizations you can draw within 15 minutes, okay? So let's stick with these. And by the way, I'm cutting off anything that I think you guys would not be able to reasonably do within the 15-minute limit, okay? So this is something that I think you guys should be able to do within the 15-minute time limit, okay? So now that we've clarified the context, let's try to build the arguments, okay? What arguments do you think would be there based on the contextualization that we did? The 3 things. Yep.
About the economy, like if you're replacing people by machines, people are not making money anymore. Lots of people get jobless, unemployed.
Yep.
And due to that, like they have less money to spend, so the economy will decrease.
So the circulation of the economy will be deteriorated, and the flow will be deteriorated. Right, but I think it's better, to tie the arguments back to the context, okay? So I think a context that we can tie back to that specific argument is that usually entire regions are based and entirely dependent upon this specific industry. So the effects that robot replacement can have on the entire region is exclusively devastating, and that entire regions of people, most of the people in that specific region, depend upon that company and that industry for jobs. So if this company starts automating, it's totally different from, say, when a restaurant joint is automating, right? So that's how you make this policy exclusive to the actual problem of the motion. Try to connect the argumentations back to the context that you build. Okay, so we would be able to jobs. We would be able to tie that back to the second. What would you be able to say for the second argument, though? Any ideas? Imagine you were debating this. I'd say you can argue principle. I think you can argue the very basic argument that if the government intervened for the convenience of your industry at the cost of sacrificing other industries and at the same time involved in heavily subsidizing your exclusive industry for your development, then the society has a reasonable claim to what property you actually earned in the process, right? So it's like the typical trickle-down effect idea that you guys always use, right? Like if you prop up an industry, then that industry for some reason has the obligation to give back to society the earnings that they actually got from the society, okay? So I'd say the principle applies here, but what would make this argument exclusive is that this industry received a totally different level of government intervention, government support, and, for instance, exclusion of certain actors from the market in the process of these industries being built. So that is what would make this argument more exclusive, okay? So I'd say I would be able to tie this principal argument back with, 1 and 3. So, any other ideas? I think we're gonna have to try another motion after this. Not a lot of people are that enthusiastic. I know, like we're all tired. But okay, so let's assume that you're closing for this motion, and your opening took both of these arguments, and you're kind of stuck. Like, what extension would you make? Usually, a typical strategy for closing, I think, would be to identify a relatively new actor and try to develop an argument based on that actor and try to impact why that actor is the most important actor in the debate. Okay? So, no ideas. Okay, cool. I'll just try to move on to the second step. So, no, not the second step actually. The fifth step. This is more of a, I think, something I might do. If you're really out of arguments to run, like for instance, you have this pressure that you need 3 arguments for the debate. By the way, you really don't. And you're just out of things to say. And you just need to label that one additional argument. I think the best strategy is to try to think of like various actors in the debate, okay? Like I said before. Identify actors. And to be fair, I think the 5th step can happen in the first step, actually. No, not the first step. First step. Like in between the 2nd and 3rd step. Especially if you really can't think of that major problem. If you identify enough actors, you can generate or fit in a problem that likely applies for that specific actor, okay? So let's try to think of various actors relevant to this debate. First is, as I said before, multiple stuff here. These industries we were talking about, right? Number 2, the government. Number 2, probably, and number 3, probably the citizens in the region. Have any other ideas?
Employees.
Yeah, let's include that with the 3rd category. Within the 3rd category.
Customers.
Yeah, sure. Customers?
Corporations?
Corporations, yeah, sure.
Suppliers. Suppliers.
I would include that with corporation, within that category. I think there is a very intuitive actor though. Like it says, this house supports robot taxes. What? Robots, yeah. Well, not the robots themselves, obviously. Robot developers. But I think 2 of the actors, well, one of them were there, kinda, but 2 of them are relatively new, right? the corporations and the robot developers, right? So I think as an extension at this point, where there are already two arguments, one, the very general economy argument, and number two, the principle that these companies exclusively owe it to society for their development and stuff like that, I think we can make additional, like, I guess, extensions about, number one, the specific calculus of the corporations, and number two, the robot developers, okay? So let's try to do that. First, the robot developers, I think. It's pretty intuitive, I think. So, any ideas on the robot developers? First off, who develops robots? Let's try to start with that. Who develops robots? Huh? Sorry, what?
Engineers.
Engineers, yeah, sure, but where do those engineers like belong to?
Corporations.
Corporations, yeah, sure. That's one.
University.
Yeah, that was actually one of the answers I was looking for. Universities.
The government.
Yeah, the government. So like this, there are multiple subsets of actors even within a single category of actors, okay? So let's talk about corporate robot developers. How would their incentives change?
They'll make less robots because of the tech.
They'll make less robots, sure. And plus, I think to a large degree, corporations will have less incentives to fund robot development projects, right? So why would that be a problem?
No innovation.
Well, no innovation, yeah, sure. But again, I think to a certain extent, like most people take it as a given that innovation is important. Probably that's not the healthiest practice in the debate. Perhaps innovation is not important at all. So why is innovation important? Simple. It opens room for more jobs. So I think to a large degree, you can argue to a reasonable degree that you're taking away opportunities for more jobs to be created. Okay? And that kind of goes back to the initial argument that we need to care about people's jobs and their employment opportunities, right? So number one, I'd say more jobs. But number two, are there additional reasons why innovation is important? Probably that, okay, so let's try to go back to robot, the word robot. What are some of the robots you guys know? Huh? Like if you had to categorize robots, how would you categorize them?
What kind of field they're working in?
Sure. So I guess the standard can be field of robot use.
Home robot and factory robot.
Yeah, sure. That kind of goes in field though.
Teacher?
Huh?
Teacher?
Sorry?
Like,
Teachers?
yeah, how they're shaped.
Yeah, guys, these are all great, but try to think of the relevance of these standards to the motion. So like how you would be able to use these standards for the motion. So the prime variable of this debate was replaceability, right? Remember?
So if they use AI or not?
Probably. I think that's closer to the answer I was looking for. Probably robots that substitute human functions and robots that complement human functions, right? They're called complementary robots, substitutory robots in professional terms, okay? So probably the robots would include AI and stuff like that. Things that can replace humans in the end. But there are also robots that help human functions and create more jobs, right? Probably we're talking about this in this debate, but probably robot developers develop both. See what I'm getting at here? So probably, if you significantly tax substitution robots, then won't these companies have less money to fund complementary robots that can, for instance, help human functions and help the efficiency of human working? So I think that's another argument. Yep. Okay. So
But that is an argument against tax, right?
sorry.
That's an argument against the tax.
So yeah, sure. So that would be op case. So I think for Gulf case, you would argue that complementary robots. Just a second. So I think what you would argue for Gulf is that usually though, since the taxation would be focused on complementary robots anyway, the taxation on the robot industry itself will not really harm the innovation in general. Because usually these substitutory robots are the ones that would be taxed, not the complementary ones. So the government would try to specify what kind of robots would actually be taxed.
Then is it still an argument against tax? Because like tax for substitutional robots means less money for robot developments, means less innovations, means less complementary robots.
Yeah, so that's because I told you the argument beforehand. Like, I'm talking about the situation where if I didn't tell you this argument beforehand, and if the government side characterizes robots, it would be strategic for them to just categorize the target of their policy to substitution robots, not complementary robots. So the government, I think, can reasonably limit their policy to say that they would only tax substitution robots. I think it's not unreasonable. Okay? So, like this, number one. So we're done with the first category. Okay? We already have ourselves an extension, but what about universities and the government? Let's try to tie this together, since I think these two are kind of similar, right? KAIST, it's a government organization. At the same time, it's a university, right? So what government argument would you be able to run out of this? Or even opposition argument. At this point, I don't care. I'd say, yeah, sure.
With tax on robots, you get more money for the government, and the government can like subsidize universities to stimulate development.
Yeah, actually that is an argument. So you get a positive cycle where the government gains more tax resources to fund the development of robot technology. But number two, I think you can tie this back to the principle. Can you guys try that? So the initial principle argument was that the government heavily funded and created an environment for these industries to grow, right? So let's try to tie the tech argument back. In most cases, let's first off talk about the nature of robot funding then. Like, which entity do you think funds robot technology development the most?
Universities.
Well, not necessarily universities, but it's not like the rate of support corporations provide for the actual robot technology development is usually lower than the government subsidization and direct government fundings for robot technology. Meaning, the government usually funds the development of robot technology more than corporations do. The reason being, what do you think is the reason?
Government sees that the long term.
Yeah, the government sees the long term. Usually robot technology consumes immense capital while yielding very small short-term returns. And corporations, because naturally they are shareholder interest tied, need to produce short-term results, right? So what I would say is that universities and the government are usually the ones that build up the technology, and that's what those technologies are what the corporations use to develop their own robots. So why would this be tied to the principle?
Basically, the robots made by the university and government can be used by the new industries that they're developing.
Sure, but I think so. If I am to elaborate on that further, I would argue that the claim that these corporations have over their technology is not full. The reason being, the technology they based their technological innovations on originated from government research. So I would say that the technological innovations that these corporations made to build their own robots were made possible because of government research and government academic research on robots that laid the cornerstones of the robot technology development. So I would say that the claim that these corporations have over their patents, over their stuff on robot technology may not be as exclusive as they claim it. So that would be tied back to the principle, okay? So I think that in and of itself is an argument too. Any other arguments for, say, we're done with robot developers, right? What about corporations?
I feel like we would only have against arguments on the corporation side.
Sorry?
I think there would only be arguments against this proposition from the corporation side.
Sure, so have a go.
If you tax it, you make this more expensive, even though robots technically would make the process cheaper than using human labor.
Yeah, sure, number one. Like, yeah, I think most arguments for corporations would actually end up as off arguments. So let's try to think of that. Number one, yeah, sure, corporations would have less incentives to develop. Number two, what would be some other arguments? Okay, at this point, I think like I can give you arguments, but like these aren't arguments from this point on. I don't think there are realistically arguments that you can think of within 15 minutes. So I'll just end it here. I think this is enough. Okay. So like this, so we built a general case for this motion. Okay. So let me try to go back through the processes and let's just do a quick practice on another motion that I think is nice. Like, any further questions on this motion? Yeah.
Yeah. So we went through the 5 steps, and I was curious how, for example, you would advise us. So forgive me, I'm really beginner on this.
Yeah. Sure.
I found that all of these steps seem to be really interesting. How would you advise us to like divide our time within all these steps to go carefully through each of them?
Right.
Because it seems like we might spend too much time on each one, and I don't know how to, kind of divide it efficiently.
Yeah, sure. So this is really like I didn't give you the timeline for this because like it really depends on debate style, and case prep style. Most debaters, for instance, devote like 5 minutes out of the 15 minutes to think on their own, but my style of case prep is kind of different. Like I start discussing the context with my partner right away because I think I'm the kind of debater that heavily emphasizes context and building up on like the setting of the debate and stuff like that. So so typically I would devote like out of 15 minutes, maybe 5 to 6 minutes on context development with my partner. Number two, after that, wait a sec. So you want me to explain using these 5 steps, right? So identify words that act as variables. I think I would use like a minute at max. It doesn't take that long. Generally obvious problems, I think you can do these 2 within 1 minute. The third thing, the context under which the problem exists. I would devote to close to 6 to 7 minutes on this one. And for the other steps, I would use like, for instance, I think I would use like 3 minutes to identify as many actors as possible. And from 2 to 3 minutes, I think I would use that time to like organize my thoughts and stuff like that. But again, I think this is really like, I don't think this is a set way of how you should be doing things. And to be fair, like as I said before, I emphasize the contextualization a lot heavily compared to other debaters. Okay?
Would you kind of split the prep with your partner or kind of do more together? For example, the stakeholders analysis.
I never split with my partner. I usually just discuss right away. But that, again, that's not the norm for many debaters. Most debaters take 5 minutes to think on their own and share their ideas with their partner. So realistically, I don't think my way of case building is the norm. Realistically, however, I think you need to devote at least 5 minutes to develop what context you're developing under and the actors that exist within the debate. So at least, my advice is that at least for steps 3 and 5, contextualization and actor analysis, at least devote 5 minutes together for these 2 processes together. Okay? At least 5 minutes, okay? But like as I said before, you don't need to be pressured to develop arguments. I know it's like pressuring within 15 minutes that like you need something to say for 7 minutes and 30 seconds. So if you guys are busy developing 3 arguments, you really just don't need that. It's very possible to win a debate with one really hell-assly good argument. That's why, and I think those arguments usually come with good contexts. Okay? Principle is tied with context. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it may be your biased opinion for this question, but in your experience, which step people tend to underestimate the most?
Underestimate.
Like besides the context, right? Because you emphasize that the context is important. So what else people don't spend enough time or effort on, but they have to, at least from your point of view?
I think they overemphasize the structure of arguments, having labels for arguments, and they underestimate this part, other than the context, I think. Identifying words. For instance, I think, for this motion, I think, at a certain point when I was explaining the case, you guys forgot the word robot, right? Guys, kinda, like, get my point? Like, at a certain point where I was explaining the context for this debate, at a certain point, guys, I think, would have thought of this debate as, like, a factory debate. Well, sure it is, but, like, again, this should be tied back to robots, okay? So, anyways, like, I don't think that's an important, like, thing. I think, however, yes, the contextualization is very important. And in that, if you don't have a contextualization, as I said before, you're going to end up with really general arguments like robots replacing people, bad. We need to protect these people. Like hell, we replace people on a daily basis. You replace other people to get jobs. Like the government does not have an obligation to stop you from getting a job so that you replace other people. Like it's not exclusive, I'm telling you. That's why if you want to highlight why this policy specifically is necessary for solving the problem, you need a context. So, okay, so I think we're done with this one. So to summarize, okay, the first step, I think, is to identify certain words that may be variables within the debate. Words that kind of change the direction of the debate. Actually, I think also something that I didn't discuss. I think it's strategic for a government to define what they mean by support, right? Because to be fair, like support means a lot of things. It means incentivization. In terms of this actual policy, the only country on the face of this planet actually to implement a policy vaguely as similar to this is interestingly South Korea. The Moon Jae-in administration in 2017 lowered the tax benefits and tax breaks that they've been giving to robot companies. But interestingly, no other country on the face of the planet, like Europe, like the entire European continent, or the United States of America, ever actually passed this policy. Okay? So, like this, there are contexts. So I'd say, for instance, and also, there's also the issue of when you're trying to define a policy, or when you're trying to define key verbs within a debate, like for instance, support, it's important to decide what range you're willing to support this. So, meaning, this kind of goes back to context. How many countries do you want implementing this policy? For instance, I think specifically for this policy, I think it's a lot strategic that if possible, if given fiat, you would expand this policy to the global scale. So every nation on the face of the planet should be doing it. Because the reason I would use this strategy is because, well, suppose the United States of America imposes this policy, but Europe doesn't. In which case, all the tech companies will just move to Europe and do the same thing. Get it? So there is literally no change achieved. You're just changing the location of the same companies that are presumably causing the shit show and the current status quo. Right? So, like this, see, even I, in this case, did not really look word by word carefully, right? So like this, I think the first step is kind of underestimated. The second step is trying to develop, yes, a really general version of the problem, just enough to contextualize. The third step is contextualization. And in the third step, I talked about how you should strategically narrow down or expand the context according to the benefit of what side you are on, and give justifications on why it should be narrowed down or why it should be expanded. The fourth step fourth, fifth step-ish, the fourth step and fifth step-ish, I think. The order between the fourth and fifth is kind of shaky, depends on the motion. Is identifying actors and then actually moving on into the arguments, okay? This is why I think OG is tricky in VP debates, because OG really ends up with only 15 minutes. Like, in the case of closing government, for instance, you get like what? 15 plus 7.5 minutes, 4 7.5-minute speeches, so in total 45 minutes to think and develop a very sophisticated context. So, and that's why I think judges are very, very strict on closing government being derivative of opening government, because they have 45 minutes to think, like compared to opening government. So obviously their contextualization would be a lot more sophisticated. Like, I don't think, like, if I were CG for this, I think I would be able to add so much more context. Like, for instance, I talked about China and India, right? Developing nations, but not necessarily developed, that also has a very booming automation industry. I would talk about those things as well. So it's possible to add a lot of sophistication once you're closing government. So don't be afraid to like be closing government. I mean, I know it's, in many cases your arguments are derivative, but it's, you can cover that with additional context, okay? So let's try a really, really quick practice. Let's literally time 15 minutes. It's 10:14 right now. We're gonna do this practice for 15 minutes, 10:30, and end the class, okay? So the motion is, this is also a motion I got from a very recent session in some society. Right, okay. So I'm a pseudo doctor, so I'm a health major. Yay. I know about this stuff. So we have 15 minutes. Time starts now. So rack up your brains, people. Okay, so what was the first step? It was to identify the words that act as variables, right? So how I would do this is try to identify what we mean, okay? So probably national insurance system in and of itself is not contentious, but you would need additional characterization. So you would try to skip this part to the contextualization part. Should charge differently based on lifestyle choices, okay? So this part needs kind of a clarification, right? Charge differently. What do you mean by charge? Charge differently. Under what standard would you charge differently? Probably if you have unhealthy lifestyles and stuff that would influence the country's expenditure on you, right? Something that would make the country's expense on you qualitatively or quantitatively different, okay? And lifestyle choices. What lifestyle choices would be relevant to that, therefore? Smoking, drinking, which is what we're going to do later. Okay, so lifestyle. Okay, so that was 57 seconds, okay? Right, so that was the first step. Second step, okay, general problem. People smoke to death, and they're using resources. I think that's the most intuitive problem, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, that was it.
People are living unhealthy.
Yeah. People drain resources. Right. Context. Third. Let's move on to the third step. We're on 1:30 right now.
Lots of insurance costs. People need to live more healthy.
Yeah, sure. Like, I think I would add that live healthily. Right. So let's move on to the context, okay? So the national insurance system, let's try this first because we kind of skipped this, okay? So what characteristics exist for the national insurance system? Probably America does have it too, I believe, Affordable Health Care Act, although Trump is about to repeal it. Like, yeah, like it's on the verge of being repealed. Okay, so number one, it uses tax resources, duh. Number two, policy that benefits the poor or the povertized? Because obviously rich people can get their own insurances, right? They have tons of insurances. They have like AIG, stuff like that. Okay? So it impacts poor like a welfare system. Number 3. I think this is tied to number 1. It uses taxes. Tax resources are dwindling, especially in many developed states that are aging. Because if you have an aging population, likely you would be unemployed. The ratio of the population that are unemployed would be higher. Therefore, the ability to pay taxes is compromised for citizens. Therefore, if you have an aging population, likely your tax resources for this specific part, the NIS, would decrease, which is why Korea, it is stated that Korea's funds for NIS, the Korean National Insurance System, would start declining from 2020. Okay, so we're all screwed. We have to pay for old people. Okay, so dwindling resources. Okay, so I think that's enough for NIS, like under reasonable knowledge, right? Okay, so lifestyle choices. What would we be able to say about drinking? Why do we drink? Wow, that was actually philosophical. Why do we drink? Okay.
Social conventions?
Yeah, social conventions, exactly. And by the way, guys, feel free to jump in with op arguments. I don't really care. Social conventions. So there's a culture. Like, there's a culture of us going to socials and making people drink. There's a culture of people thinking that we need to drink once they are offered drinks, right? So there's a social culture. Number 2.
There's also addictions that can come from
Addictions. Yeah, sure. Are there previous conventions or are there previous penalties that the government has been implying or applying for bad lifestyle choices?
Drunk driving.
Well, sure, drunk driving, but I would say that's kind of different. Drunk driving, yeah, sure. This is actually an op argument, but I would say that, like, the government poses and places sin taxes. Crazy amounts of sin taxes on cigarettes and alcohol. And they set age limits, that's why, right? Okay, so I think up to this point, so we clarified the context for national insurance system and lifestyle choices. We're still on 5 minutes. We still have 10 left. So, we're half done with 3. So, are there any other social contexts that you guys can think of? Okay, so let's delve
What
deep.
about economic status?
Economic
So
status.
like people like in poor positions wouldn't really have access to like healthier stuff. So like wouldn't they have like
Interesting.
poor like life, seeing like poor life choices?
Some poor life choices are forced under circumstances. Yeah, actually, that's great. Also, it's been proved. Yeah, sure.
To elaborate on that, it's like when you don't smoke and when you don't, I think even when you don't drink, that you like help the economy forward because people are more healthy, can think clearly.
I would say that you're jumping to the 4th step, which is arguments. But yeah, sure. So if people are healthier, less expenditures, and
Also.
yeah, sure. So that would be the 4th step. Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's just move on to the 4th step then.
Also another thing, would you charge them differently as well if they were healthier?
So probably that would have to be specified under the policy. But yeah, sure. Why not?
Because we mentioned a lot of things that would make a bad impact, but lifestyle choices encompasses also healthy lifestyle.
So yeah, I think what would realistically happen if you implement this policy is that everyone would be charged additionally, like 5% or something. And if you are proven to have a really, really healthy record, a healthy health record, then this goes down to 0. Or if you are proven to have a really shit lifestyle, this kind of goes to 10% or something like that. I think that is what would realistically happen. But I think, sure, why not? Charge differently. Let's try to specify on that. How would you charge differently? Based on your income? A specific rate fixed to your income? So for instance, would you charge 5% like out of your entire income. So for instance, if it's Bill Gates that earns like $100 billion and if lifestyle happens to be shit, then does he deserve to pay $5 billion? Or do you want to set a certain amount and not the ratio? I think that's also part of the debate. What do you guys prefer? Ratio. Yeah, sure, why not? How would you justify the ratio though? I think, yeah.
You know how in China their national health insurance system is divided between social groups and depending on where you live? Like what type of work do you do? Are you a farmer? Are you a student? Are you unemployed?
Yeah, sure.
Whatever. So social conditions and also work opportunities.
Yeah, so I think you would add the China context to this. Like we can try something similar. Although I think realistic limitations would exist because like,
I have a question. Is the poor life choices like only limited to like drinking and stuff? Because what about people who like indulge in like kind of like adrenaline, almost like adrenaline rush kind of activities, kind of like like paragliding and things like that? Couldn't those be seen like dangerous?
of course they can be seen as dangerous.
So would that also be seen like as like a poor life choice?
Like that's up to you guys. Do you think it should be included? But to be fair, I think to a large part, you can charge those activities like with mechanisms like syntax already. I don't think there's an additional need to use the NIS for this, especially when, for instance, if it's the case of like paragliding, you land on the ground, there's no further harm done. So there is no continuous harm in your bodily systems that require the NIS to additionally like provide expenditures on you. So I think those things can be nuanced. Okay, sure. So we're still on 8 minutes. Sure, guys. So it's 9 minutes actually. 6 minutes for arguments. Let's go. So based on a lot of these contexts you guys mentioned, what arguments would you be able to like extract?
Maybe before the arguments, it would still make sense to also specify what national insurance system covers and how it covers, because there are different types of care, right? There are different proportions on how much person pays, like fee for service, and which is covered, because it will depend on like our ideology that we're going to be promoting, for example.
Okay, so in that case, sure. What models of healthcare do you know other than China?
NHS.
Like NHS? Right, sure. Which model do you think would be ideal for this case though? I think to a certain degree, you would have to assume for this motion that if you're going to have the NIS charge you, and if you presume that the NIS has the authority to charge anyone, the NIS would have to have a reasonable influence in society. The NIS would need to be reasonably powerful within the society, right? In order for them to have the authority to charge you, right? So I think this debate would make less sense, for instance, the United States of America, where healthcare isn't as universal as most people would like it. Probably this policy would make sense with countries that have a developed health system or a health insurance system, right? So maybe China, sure. South Korea, I think, works. Northwestern European states, I think, would work. Any other ideas on how to specify this?
Like, does it pay for public or private healthcare? Some of the health insurances don't pay for private healthcare. Some do. Like, does it cover long-term care? Does it cover palliative care?
I think, okay, so like, yeah, sure. So, like,
No, I know.
okay, so let's add that, sure. I think at this point, though, we're running out of time. And guys, by the way, like, sure, it's nice to have a lot of context, but try to move on after a certain time period, okay? Like, at this point, we're using too much time on, like, context. Like, it's like our 11th minute. So, like, let's try to move on to arguments now, okay? So out of all of this, what would you be able to make? Number one, like what you mentioned earlier, that resources are being drained under the unique context where there's an aging population, and therefore expenditures need to be cut. Number two, any other ideas on that? Any other arguments?
That's such a like charge difference could promote a healthier lifestyle, which would probably decrease the amount of people that would need it in the long-term run. So like if people are getting charged differently, then later on they probably wouldn't want to continue being charged that way, so they might influence a like lifestyle change. to probably prevent being continuously charged that way.
Okay, so I think I would label that sustainability of the system. Sustainability, viability of the system. Right?
Maybe a principle. The burden of the unhealthy should not be applied to unhealthy people.
Oh, yeah, sure. Any more? We already have like 3 arguments. Interesting. And we're still on the 12th minute. We have 3 more minutes.
If I were to be a chemist, I would say that it's really hard to define a criteria to charge differently. Because you cannot really obviously evaluate what is the healthy lifestyle. Like, if the person like has 1 drink every week, how you define like the criteria to charge them to a person that drinks like 5 drinks a week?
Yeah, okay.
Also, healthy lifestyle is more expensive. It will just reinforce poverty and inequality in your society.
Any other ideas? I'd say though that this is just basic debate stuff. It's not always the best strategy to say that standards are vague. The reason being, like sure, every standard, if you think about it, everything is hard to categorize into standards, but there usually are legal systems that allow for that standardization to happen. So sure, yeah, it's hard to track back if you have a lung disease, sure, lung cancer. It's not necessarily true that that is attributed to you smoking the hell out of yourself, but you can set, like, it's still technically possible for the government to implement standards on from what point on of smoking we will see this as a direct correlation to you getting lung cancer. It's possible to say that. So for instance, it's not impossible to say that if you've been, for instance, as the government to say, if you've been drinking 1 bottle of soju per day, if you have drank over than that, then we will charge you extra. Sure, that might not be the best standard on the planet, but it's still standardized. So I think the issue of feasibility, sure, is still there. So sure, you can question whether the standard itself is the most applicable standard, but that, I think to a certain extent, if you're going to opt this, you need to consider an even if case where even if the standards are implementable, why it still shouldn't stand.
I mean, my one question is just because, for example, even though there can be a standard, how would you ever like be sure? Like, would the person be telling how much they drink? Would you be observing their purchases? You know, that.
Yeah.
I think the government can, I think, to a certain degree, like monitor health patterns. So sure, like so. I think this motion, for instance, from Gulf's stance, would necessitate a model where, for instance, you're going to mandate that everyone gets like checkups on like a certain timely basis. So I think that is what government would have to develop as part of their policy in order for it to work. But yeah, sure. So like this though, I don't think, like, so you can talk about the realistic implications and the applications of this policy. I think, however, like, since we're not judging this debate, to a large degree, if you consider the spirit of the motion, specific applications on how this policy would be imposed on society, you can make minor modifications here and then based on the social circumstances, right? It's not impossible to change a policy once it's been implemented. I think the more core essence of this problem is whether this policy or similar lines of this policy should be implemented or not. So I think in essence, sure, if opposition supports a sin tax, in principle they're agreeing with the government that unhealthy lifestyles should be taxed. So sure, yeah, that can be a counterprop or an opposition argument, but not perhaps the most strategic one, in that you're agreeing to the principle of the government. Okay, so I think that, yeah, that was exactly 15 minutes. But I think, sure, like, you guys get the hang of it, right? You guys can make 3 arguments within 15 minutes, even while devoting time on context building. It's not impossible, okay? So I'll end my stuff here. I went 2 minutes over time. After a 10-minute break, Jihi will do the actual lecture. Yeah, sure.